My name is Nancy Bui. Today is September the 22nd, 2013. I am going to interview Mr. Marc Yablonka. We are here in Garden Grove, California. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you tell your name and your residence?
Sure. My name is Marc Yablonka.
What is your profession?
I have two professions. I'm an adjunct instructor of English at Pasadena City College, and I'm also a military journalist.
Did you write some book? Can you elaborate about it?
Absolutely, yeah. My book is called Distant War, Recollections of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and it encompasses about 20 years of my reportage on the Vietnam conflict, both during the war and after. My trips to Vietnam occurred only after the war, but I've spent about 20 years trying to document the lives and the experiences of people who both served and happened to be in Vietnam during the Indochina wars there.
Well, with your study, 20 years of study, can you tell, or did you give us an opinion about Vietnam War in general?
My opinion about the Vietnam War and all these years hence has changed dramatically. I remember, and I was thinking about this just the other day, the first time I heard the word Vietnam. I was 15 years old. It was 1965, and I was sitting in Gary Long's history class at Villa Park High School, not too far from here in Orange, California. Mr. Long was a great history teacher, and he would circumvent the globe telling the students or teaching the students about history. And I remember that one day he came in and he said, tomorrow we're going to have a debate about the war in Vietnam, and Mark, I want you to take the con, the against side. I remember going home to my father and telling him as a 15-year-old boy, Dad, what's Vietnam? Ironically, my father at the time was making a living in aerospace, and a lot of his government contracts had to do with the war. In fact, one of them was building parts for bombs that were dropped on Hanoi. At any rate, my good and kind father sat me down and gave me some education about the war. It was the first I'd heard of it. And then my experience at that point sort of took off from there. I'd say that I developed what could be called at the time an anti-war stance. I was against the war from what I read. I read, for example, that most of the people in Vietnam were so enamored of Ho Chi Minh that they would have voted him in the 1950s had they had the chance. I went to college in 1968, and again I would have, can we start that again? I guess I adopted an anti-war stance. I was involved in several of the protests that occurred on campus at the University of Oregon, and these are, I was never a radical. I considered myself a pacifist. I was against all violence. I now realize as a 63-year-old man that I had taken the wrong stance, and that in fact I'd been led by a bunch of people on the left who basically chewed up the students and used them to their own advantage. So I now feel 360 degrees different about the war. I feel that it was if you're asking me about whether my opinion has changed, I feel, knowing now so many people who served in Vietnam in various capacities, that the cause was noble, and it was one that we should have seen through to the end. I also don't subscribe to the theory that we lost the Vietnam War. Having been in Hanoi in 1992 and seeing the devastation that was then in the north and the poverty, my opinion was such that I feel that the United States, with its South Vietnamese allies, actually won that war. We may have lost it on a piece of paper in Paris, but unfortunately history doesn't record it, the United States as the winner.
Can you explain how a young man being in the family that connected to the war turned into against the war, that much.
Well, I think the fact that I had come from a liberal democratic family and been raised on liberal with a liberal viewpoint, through other issues, contributed to it. I remember a certain burnout that occurred to me in 1969 that I like to recount from time to time. I was sitting in an English class at night, and one of the radical groups at the time was the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and there I was studying English in a night class in the lecture hall, and all of a sudden these SDS guys busted through the lecture hall and said, some of our brothers have been thrown in jail at the Eugene jail, and we're marching now to protest it. And the professor at the time said, well, I'm joining the protest, and you all can do what you want. Being a young 19-year-old impressionable college student, I followed the masses and went down to downtown Eugene, and it was a very tense scene. The Eugene Police Department were there with their tactical gear, their billy clubs and tear gas canisters at the ready. And I remember feeling that there was going to be a riot at any moment. And at just about that time, a wino came up to me and he said, tell me what's going on here. And in the lingo of the day, I said, well, we're protesting the fact that some of our brothers have been thrown in jail. And he looked at me and he said, oh, if I could tell you how many times me and my brother spent in that jail. And to me, that was like, I needed to pause. Certain things have happened to me through the years, I would say, in my work as an English teacher, meeting the Vietnamese refugees, hearing their sad stories, their horrific tales of escaping communism, what they had to live through under the communist regime, the boat people, seeing a movie that was related to Cambodia about 1978 or so, called The Killing Fields, which was about the horrors that happened in Cambodia. Meeting people who, and I would say today that most of my friends are Vietnam veterans or were in Vietnam in one capacity or another, say journalists, really turned my view around 360 degrees.
So back in time, what kind of information that the anti-war movement give it to you, if you can recall, and that make you feel so angry and join them?
Well, I think it wasn't so much the information as much as, I guess a psychologist would call that peer pressure, mass psychology. It was, I think, an attractive movement for people who may have had doubts against the war to join. And when I think about it today, it's incongruous how such a movement could have gotten together in the first place. I mean, you had pacifists like myself, you had the hippies, you had the flower children from San Francisco, and then, you had the Black Panther Party, and let's face it, those folks were not pacifists. There was violence was written all over their, all of the movements that they made and all of the things that they did. How that could come together to this day baffles the mind and leads me to say what I did a few moments ago, which is that we students, we who were liberal at the time, were really led like sheep to the slaughter. When you think about it, one of the movements was encouraging young men of my age to burn their draft cards and thus face 5 years in prison. And the people that spearheaded that movement, because they were well known, may have gone to jail and gone out in relatively little time. But what about the guys that they led into that situation? Where's the empathy for them? It baffles the mind.
Do you have any friend who got caught and stayed in prison for long?
No, I didn't, and that's something I never did. As I say, I never did anything radical. I think my concern as a young boy of 19 and then 20 years old was to take it all in. I can remember one particular protest march that was on campus at the University of Oregon that I observed as a student. Tear gas canisters were thrown at us, or at the students, by National Guardsmen. And the first thing that I did after it was all over was to go to the ROTC building at the University of Oregon and knock on the door and ask if any of the guardsmen needed help, if they were okay. So I believe my view of the protest movement, the anti-war movement, was even tempered at that time.
So, but it still don't explain that why they against the war. That must because they here, they go into university, they live a peaceful life over here, a prosperity life. Why is it they care to do that? If not directed to their benefit in some way.
Right. I have a couple of thoughts. I think, first of all, you have to remember, I went to college in 1968. By then, technically, the war had been going on for 7 or 8 years, and I think what we got as students and what the country got as students from the media was this negative perception of the war, the fact that it was a stalemate, the fact that there was no end in sight, which is something that the media was promulgating to, in the press, and I think that had its overall effect. I don't know, at the time I certainly didn't know any Vietnam veterans, but I would venture to say that those students who had Vietnam veterans in their families or amongst their friends probably had a more tempered view of what was going on and a more sympathetic view. I also think that it may well be that there were more people, even as late as 1968 or 1969, who were supportive of the effort. Maybe not openly, unfortunately, but we always hear, no matter what the news story is, about the negative side, don't we?
Yes. So what about the people worried about the draft and then they...
Right. Well, that was another factor in my life at the time. I had mentioned earlier that I felt myself to be a pacifist, and I had filed a claim with my draft board for conscientious objection. That was a claim that never had to be realized because 1969, I believe it was, the lottery came out, and I had had a 2S deferment as a student, and I was lucky enough to get a high lottery number, and so breathed a sigh of relief that, told me that I wasn't going to have to go to Vietnam, something that I now wish, and I have a lot of Vietnam veterans who tell me I'm crazy for saying it or believing it, but something that I now wish I had done, that I wish I had been in Vietnam in some capacity, because let's face it, Vietnam was the event of our generation.
So on another issue that I saw now on Buddhist movie, Buddhist film from there, National Archive, I see the protester raising a communist flag and also, the South, provisional South Vietnam, or we call Vietcong flag. They raise those flag, and then they wear the banner. They have the banner. They said the American puppets. They refer to South Vietnamese people. How in the world they have that kind of thinking?
I think that they were immature and unknowing, and I think if you had taken, and again, that's something I never would have done, and I saw some of that same footage too, and witnessed some of that in protest marches, and even 1968, 69, I knew that that was not something I espoused. I think if you had taken any one of those people who raised a Viet Cong flag and put them in a communist country, they would have come back with a completely different attitude.
Can you tell me at the time and now, you said you changed your view, but at the time, you see, Jean Fonda, she was in Hanoi and went to American pilot, and then at home, people raising the enemy flag. Have you, at that time, or your friend, have any thinking about American soldier who left home, went there for the call of their own country, and people here at home, they can enjoy the freedom and then do anything they can, and yet they very much betray their own soldier out there, fighting for the country.
I thought about it a lot then, and I think about it a lot today. I never had any negative feelings about our soldiers who served in Vietnam. I had ultimate respect for them. I have more respect for them today. I have no respect at all for Miss Fonda. And I believe that what she did at the time was traitorous. I think there's a lot that is the stuff of legend, from what I understand. There's a story going around that some of the POWs gave her messages as she was leaving Hanoi, and she, put them in the hand of a North Vietnamese army general. My understanding is that that never occurred. Nonetheless, for a person to sit in the seat of an anti-aircraft weapon, whether or not you fired it or not, was a traitorous action that, if Miss Fonda's name weren't Fonda, she would probably be suffering for in some capacity today.
I don't know. She was nominated by the best woman of 21st century or 20th century. So I don't know that she...
But you see, she's Hollywood, and Hollywood has traditionally been liberal and democratic, for many, many years. So, which is not to take away from her as an actress. She may be a fine actress, but her politics at the time, which I understand she's apologized for, but Vietnam veterans that I know who have negative feelings for her say that she can never apologize enough to satisfy them, and I line up with my Vietnam veteran friends on that. Why she can still be Woman of the Year or get this Academy Award or that Academy Award, I think you'd have to ask Hollywood, not me.
Another element, talking about the Vietnamese, I also read books, the film, and they someone mentioned that, well, we have to think about the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't see that the public here understand much about Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
Because Vietnamese, now you're a professor, so you know that we have North Vietnamese, we have South Vietnamese, and we have Viet Cong, which is they work for North Vietnam, but they live in the South.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that the people gone on a protest understand Vietnamese and the consequences Vietnamese? What does that Vietnamese mean at all at the time? That they point out that they're fighting for Vietnamese. Can you recall?
I don't think, if I understand your question, take two. If you're asking me whether the protesters had the Vietnamese in mind when they protested, I suspect that was an individual thing. I suspect people in the protest movement, some had thoughts that were negative about our military being there, and others had thoughts that were concerning the welfare of the Vietnamese people who were thrust into this war. So I don't know that there's one particular answer to your question. I think it's really dependent on the war protester that you would, or former war protester in my case, who you would talk to. I think in my own case, my concern was for both.
Yeah, but at that time, what were you concerned about the Vietnamese?
That they were thrust into a war that, wars always, we tend to think of wars in terms of military, but the people who suffer the most are really the people. And I remember thinking, and by people I mean the citizens of the country where the war is going on. And at the time I remember having empathy for people thrust into a situation that, I now look at, and know, unfortunately I was not able to observe firsthand, but only, secondhand from news accounts. My feeling now about the Vietnamese people is enough to fill this room we are in, this studio. The culture, the history, everything about Vietnam and its people consumes me. I'm not sure what else I can say to that other than that there's an inexplicable bonding, or maybe it's not inexplicable, maybe it's very explicable, bond between America and Vietnamese people that will always be there because of this experience that we had together.
So, but who caused the war? Had people in the protest, and you at that time understand why we had a war?
Who caused the war at that time? I mean, I've not really given much thought to that, other than thinking from our point of view, our guys and gals went to Vietnam to stem the tide of communism, a communism that was encroaching our country, and needed to be stopped from our politicians' point of view. Whether it was done the right way from the politicians' point of view is, a series for a whole other night, a whole other day. But I guess you could say communism caused it, and communism was the reason that we, the United States, got involved in it.
So there's some war that people don't want it, but have to fight.
Yes.
Just like the South Vietnamese.
Right.
1959, on his birthday, Ho Chi Minh opened the Ho Chi Minh Trail and poured his troops out there to invade South Vietnam.
Right.
That's why we had the war.
Right.
And we fought the war since 1959 until American poured the troop there was 1965.
Right.
So we fought that there all along, and American come in to have, of course, mistake made here and there.
Yeah.
But at that time, do you think that people, public people in America, really understand that?
I'm not sure if they did or not. I certainly know that the war protesters didn't understand that. I think if they had had an inkling of what was going on in Vietnam by being, on the ground there, if they had really looked into the true character of Ho Chi Minh, who many in the West feel was, the George Washington of Vietnam and the father of the country of Vietnam, and delved into what he was really like as a person, the fact that he personally saw to the assassinations of other nationalists and other communists to get to where he did, they might have a different opinion of him.
So I need to ask you, did you recall for me one of the protests that you still remember today? What happened? What did you do in that group?
I always saw myself as as a sort of a bystander. I mean, I marched. I may have chanted, give peace a chance or whatever. Again, as I view this, I'm 63 years old now. I was 19 at the time. I hope I'm, forgiven for being misled by, or being one of the sheep that the liberal conglomeration led into thinking what we thought at the time. And I also think that that's one of the reasons why I endeavored to write my book, Distant War, because I wanted to tell the story for people like myself. The Vietnam veterans that I know, the people who were in Vietnam as Red Cross donut dollies or photojournalists or Marines or soldiers or airmen or sailors, they know what Vietnam was like. But a lot of people like myself who didn't go don't really have an inkling, or maybe they've heard the stories, but they don't know what it was like. And so I endeavored in my military reportage for such as Stars and Stripes, and Army Times, American Veteran magazine, to tell the story of Vietnam the way it was. I wanted in some way to make up for a position that I took, which at the time I didn't think was dishonorable, and I still have an understanding of why I thought what I thought. But I now realize as I approach my, senior citizenship here, that the better road would have been to get myself into the country, not in 1990 as I first did, but 1968 when I first graduated from high school, as 3 or 4 of my high school classmates did.
So talking about the role of American or Western press during the war in Vietnam, I just point out 1968, there was general attack from North Vietnam that attacked over 100 cities of South Vietnam. Two big battles, and most important battle was Hue and Saigon.
The Tet Offensive.
Yes. Anyway, both sides take heavy, loss, but actually the human loss of North Vietnam was very much like triple compared with South Vietnam and combined. But somehow the press in America here, described like a loss for American and South Vietnam. And Walter Cronkite, he went on the television and looking at the camera and said, "Mr. President, end this war is unwinnable," something like that. What do you think about the press? Report on Vietnam. What did they do? The fair report for both sides, North and South, or American and communists?
Right. Well, you mentioned Walter Cronkite, and the president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who I believe was a friend of Mr. Cronkite's, said, "If I've lost Walter, I've lost the war." I think that, and I know that there are people who subscribe to the theory that the media really lost the war. I don't know that I go that far. I know that Vietnam was the first television war. Everything from Korea and World War II before was done and sent in newspapers and reported on radio after the fact. But here a family could sit down and theoretically watch their own son being killed while they were having their TV dinner, so to speak. I believe that the press did what they were sent to do. Whether or not there could have been more reportage about the atrocities committed on the side of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, I believe that should have happened as well. It may have been a case where, I only know of three people, who were able to get north of the 17th parallel during the Vietnam War, and one because she was captured by the NVA during the Tet Offensive that you mentioned. That's French photojournalist Catherine Leroy, the late Catherine Leroy. It's not having been there, not having been, wearing the boots that many of my friends who were there, I don't feel adequate to comment on fully. But I'll tell you something that goats on me even more is something that happened after 1975, when, as you very well know, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who supported the South Vietnamese regime, either politically or in uniform, were carted off to re-education camps. 300,000 is the count that's given in Bill Laurie and R.J. Del Vecchio's book, Whitewash, Blackwash. They were in the re-education camps for up to 18 years, and up to 90,000 Vietnamese perished in those re-education camps. Yet, if you ask me, I don't want to say more important question, but certainly an additional question is, where was the media then? And they weren't there. Maybe because at that time there was a general burnout in the United States of this long war that we had fought, and the first war that we supposedly lost, although, as I said to you a few minutes ago, in my view, having been to Hanoi in 1992, I still subscribe to the fact that I believe that we won that war. Nonetheless, there was virtually no reportage of it. The only famous voice that I'm aware of that said anything, again through Bill Laurie and R.J. Del Vecchio's book, was the famous folk singer Joan Baez, who took out an ad in the New York Times protesting the fact that hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people were subjected to this. I believe the media should have been there in full force. This was, as inhumane as anything that's befallen anyone in history.
Well, thank you for saying not just missing what happened to the South after the communists took over the South. They also missed a big part of the North during the totalism regime. They complain so much about the South don't have enough freedom, but the North don't have any freedom at all. You know, when they took the North, they arrest the writer, put them in prison, and then everything belonged to the state, including the writer. Have no newspaper on any form of media belong to anyone but the government. They conduct what they call land reform, that they kill 100,000 of people and put in prison millions of people, and nobody report that.
Right.
So that's why the reason of the war didn't come out clearly. They only look at the South. So I think that in many Vietnamese, we see that is the missing, or the unfair of the American press. And they even go on with the North Vietnam, call the South Vietnam like American puppet. And none of them call North Vietnam like Russian or Chinese puppet. You can see that, and that's...
I see it clearly, and I have no argument against that. I have nothing I can say that would counter what you've said.
Yeah, what I want to ask you the question, with my long statement, I want to ask that at that time, any of you thinking about what happened to North Vietnam society, anybody have that question in mind, try to find out why is that, what happened in the North?
Well, certainly nobody I knew. Again, you're talking about someone who at 18, 19, 20 years of age was then against what was going on in Vietnam, but I have no recollection of anyone delving into what was going on in the North among the student protesters. Did it not happen? I can't say. It just wasn't, I think my focus was the people of Vietnam in general, not just those in the North and what had befallen them, but the country, Vietnam en toto was, I think, what I was thinking at the time.
So now I ask you a question that how, when, and how did you change your mind to a 60 degree?
To think the way I think about.
Think about the Vietnam War.
Well, it was a conglomeration, to use that word again, of so many things. It was meeting the Vietnamese people who came to, as I mentioned to you earlier, I started teaching English as a second language in 1975, about 4 or 5 months after Saigon fell. And so we got the first wave of the Vietnamese refugees who, for example, landed south of here in Camp Pendleton. Befriending them, hearing their stories of what it was like to be in the war. And as the years went on, 76, 77, 78, when the boat people started to arrive, hearing those stories, being invited into their homes for Tet, starting to study the war. 1988, I found myself in graduate school at the University of Southern California, and I did a master's thesis on Indo-Chinese refugees. So learning not only about what had befallen the Vietnamese refugees, but also the Laos and the Cambodian refugees really changed my mind. I believe, too, that going to Vietnam as I did in 1990 the first time, and I can remember clearly landing in Saigon at Tan Son Nhut and being taken to my hotel, which was the Cat Chan Continental, the Continental Hotel, District 1, and leaving my room and going out into Lam Son Square and being instantly inundated by street urchins who, with their hands up, saying, "Baba, Baba, give me money," and seeing the poverty that, in the South, people had to endure. I remember being invited to dinner in Cho Lon in the Chinese Quarter at the uncle of a Vietnamese American colleague of mine at the time. And all of a sudden, in the middle of dinner, the electricity went out. And the young cousin of my colleague struggling to light a generator so that we could have light in their house, and fainting because of it. So many things that were an eye-opener. Just feeling like when I went to Vietnam, I was in the center of the universe, that this is literally, and that this is where it happened, as I write about in my book, Distant War. Being enamored of the culture, studying the languages I did for 2 years at UCLA, and ultimately marrying into the culture that really changed my perception of what went on then. Getting to know Vietnam veterans, either as a journalist or as a friend or both, hearing their stories, again, really taught me that even though I was 18 or 19 years old at the time and very impressionable, I should have opened my mind, my ears, and my eyes to the other side of the story more than I did.
So do you have any contact or any relationship with the people you call Vietnamese prisoner after the war? And,
I'm sorry, go
tell
ahead.
about that.
Vietnamese refugees after the war?
No, yes, refugees, but they were in the prison after the war.
Oh, absolutely. Well, for one, my brother-in-law, who lives in Toronto today, he spent 6 years, because he was in the Vietnamese Marines, and he believed the propaganda that because you're an officer, you only have to have re-education for my Basa would be able to tell you exactly how long. He was told better than I, but I think it was a matter of a few weeks. He went willingly, and 6 years later, he was still trying to escape from the re-education camp. He kept escaping, and they kept catching him, and finally he did get out, was a boat person, and ended up on an island in Malaysia, in a United Nations camp where treatment wasn't the greatest thing in the world. He jokingly says to this day, I had to get out of here. This was not much better than the VC. And he did. He settled in Canada, and it took 6 years for him to bring my wife and her whole family to Toronto. So I talked to my brother-in-law about it quite frequently, and I've read other accounts of people who suffered in the re-education camps.
I read your book, Distant War, Collection of Vietnamese, Laos and Cambodia, and I see many stories you describe about American soldiers went to Vietnam, did a wonderful thing for the people besides fighting the war.
Mm-hmm.
The medic people, the soldier. How did you get those stories? And during that time, you have anything to change your mind about Vietnam veteran?
Oh, absolutely, sure. And just now, in my age, when I interview a Vietnam veteran, those parts of my body that I said should have been more open are now open, and so they contributed. How I got the story, I guess, goes back to when I decided to go to journalism school, and it was after seeing the film The Killing Fields, which was about the Cambodian connection to the Vietnam War. Hang Nor, by the way, Dr. Hang Nor, who was the star of that film, happened to have been a student in my class, and I recognized him right away. I told the person I was with at the time that I know that guy from somewhere, and then it clicked that he'd been my student for several months prior. And I, having gone to journalism school and learning, how to go about securing interviews helped me a lot. But the time I did go to J school, as we call it, was 1985, and by that time there had been a lot of writing about Vietnam. A lot of it, some people would tell you, one-sided, but certainly it was out there. As a journalist, I strove, and I still strive, to look at things from different angles. Thank you for reading my book, by the way. One of the things in putting the book together was to try to tell the stories of people who, one wouldn't normally write about when thinking about war. Two or three people come to mind. One is Pat Sajak, who is the game show host for the Wheel of Fortune TV show. Not too many people know that Pat was a Vietnam veteran. And as he would tell you if he were here, his biggest audience when he was in radio was on Armed Forces Radio Saigon. And how I came to interview him was that I was watching him interview actor Dennis Franz from the TV show NYPD Blue. Dennis Franz is a Vietnam veteran. And it came out in his interview with Dennis on a show that was on Fox News, a short live show that was on Fox News. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be good to interview Pat Sajak, which I did actually for two different magazines at the time. And as things in TV go, I was allotted 15 minutes to interview him, and it was going to be by telephone. And I had read or seen on TV that on Wheel of Fortune, one of Pat's contestants had won a lot of money, and Pat went to hug the gentleman, and the gentleman turned around and sued Pat for bodily injury. So the day of our appointed interview came, and Pat calls me on the phone, and he says, "Let's see, Mark, what am I supposed to be talking to you about?" And I said, "Pat, don't worry, I'm not going to sue you." And so a 15-minute interview ended up being an hour on the phone. It was very gracious of his time. As I mentioned earlier to you, I know that in war, people who suffer a lot are the people in the country. Of course, the soldiers do too, but the people who live in the country suffer. And so I endeavored in the writing of the book to interview civilians, one of whom is the Vietnamese American actress Kieu Chin, also very gracious of her time. I just looked for different angles that haven't perhaps been covered by a lot of media or in a lot of publishing.
Well, so I thank you for story. One last question. I think that before last question is I heard you have some regrets. So what do you most regret about?
What do I most regret? That I wasn't in Vietnam when I should have been, in some capacity, either as a writer or journalist, if not a soldier, an NGO, because I truly feel that the Vietnam War, and I say this knowing that some 40 years, 45 years hence, other sabers are rattling, to quote a friend of mine who was in Vietnam, in the Middle East. But that aside, for people our generation, Vietnam was it. And while it gives me satisfaction to do what I do, reporting on Vietnam, writing on Vietnam, introducing people who served in Vietnam to those of us who were not, if I had one wish in life, it would have been, or would be, to travel back in time and to have been in Vietnam when it was happening. Again, my Vietnam veterans say, "You're crazy, you could have come back in a body bag, you could have come back without an arm or a leg," but I still feel like I missed the event of our time.
Thank you, sir. And then my last question is, do you want to talk about anything that I haven't asked you yet? Please share.
I'm sure when I get home, I'll probably think of about 10 or 12 things, but right now, I think it's for me to thank you for what you're doing with this project, and I would also like to thank each and every person who was in Vietnam, who sacrificed what he and she did for this country, and hopefully for the Vietnamese people, to thank you all from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure.